The house on the hill always looked like a monument to silence. Its tall windows were rarely open, its lights rarely on, and its owner, Elena, was more of a rumor than a neighbor. People whispered about her in the town below. Some said she had inherited everything from a family that wanted nothing to do with her. Others said she built her fortune herself, cutting ties with anyone who tried to get close. All I knew for sure was that every time I passed that house, I felt an ache in my chest, like the walls were holding in more than just wealth. They were holding in a woman who had decided that loneliness was safer than loved. I didn't plan to walk up that long gravel driveway the day I did. I was carrying my own burdens, running from my own storms, and maybe that's why her silence called to me. There's something about people who live in their shells. You can sense when their heart is quietly screaming for someone to listen. I had seen her once before in town. Her beauty wasn't the kind that asked for attention, but the kind that held it hostage. Dark hair, tied back too tightly as if she wanted to punish herself for being soft. Eyes that never lingered long enough on anyone to allow closeness. A woman who looked like she had won battles on the outside but lost countless ones on the inside. That afternoon, rain had just ended and the air smelled like wet earth. I walked past her gate, telling myself I was just curious, but curiosity alone doesn't make you knock on a stranger's door. No, it was something deeper, an instinct that told me her silence wasn't chosen freely. It was forced on her by years of betrayal, judgment, and fear. I raised my hand, and when my knuckles touched the heavy oak, the sound echoed like I had broken a rule. When she opened the door, she didn't look surprised. She looked tired. Tired like she had been expecting someone for years, and when she finally opened that door, she wasn't sure if she wanted to let them in or push them away. Her voice was calm, clipped, but there was a tremor hidden beneath. "Do I know you?" she asked, her eyes narrowing, her body angled like a gate half open. "No," I said simply. "But maybe you should." For a moment, silence stretched between us, heavy but electric. I could see her hesitate, measuring the risk. She lived in a fortress, not because she was proud of what she had, but because she feared what it would cost her to let anyone step inside. I smiled softly, a smile I hoped could disarm her defenses, and when she finally stepped aside, I knew something had shifted. She had let me into her house, yes, but more than that, she had let me into the edge of her world. The interior wasn't what I expected. Expensive furniture, carefully chosen art, but not a single sign of warmth. It was a house dressed up for guests who would never come. Every surface looked untouched, every chair unwelcoming, like even she didn't feel comfortable here. I traced the air with my eyes, sensing the years of silence that had gathered like dust. She walked ahead of me, her movements deliberate, her back straight, but I caught the slightest falter in her steps, as if she hadn't had company in so long she forgot how to guide someone into her space. We sat in the living room, and I asked her nothing at first. I just looked at her, and she didn't like it. She fidgeted, her fingers brushing against each other, her lips parting as though she wanted to fill the silence but didn't know with what. That's when I said, "You look like someone who's been carrying the weight of the world for too long. Doesn't it get heavy?" Her eyes met mine sharply, and I saw a flicker of anger, then sadness, then something that looked frighteningly close to relief. No one had asked her that. No one had dared. She wanted to deny it, but denial takes energy, and she was exhausted. Her voice broke softer this time. It's the only way I know how to survive. I leaned in, resting my hands together, keeping my voice low. Survival isn't the same as living. You can survive and still be dying inside. The words seemed to pierce her, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. Her eyes filled with a shine. She quickly blinked away. I knew then that she wasn't cold, she was fragile, cracked in places no one had seen because she had learned to hide the pieces behind walls of fortune and success. She thought solitude was safer, but solitude was just another kind of prison. The air between us grew heavier, but not suffocating. It was like the moment before a storm breaks, full of tension and unspoken truths. She finally whispered, almost to herself, "Why are you here?" I didn't have an answer that would make sense. I could have said I was curious, or that I was lonely too, or that something about her drew me in like a moth to flame. But the truth was simpler. Because no one deserves to be this alone, I said, and in that fragile confession, something in her walls cracked. It wasn't a full collapse, not yet, but I saw it, the faintest glimpse of hope flickering through the fortress she had built. She didn't smile, but her eyes softened, and for the first time, Elena looked at me not as a stranger but as someone who might just see her, not her fortune, not her silence, the night stretched on in low conversation. Every word was a step closer to a truth she had buried for years. And while she spoke carefully, cautiously, I knew this was the beginning of something neither of us could walk away from. She had thought solitude was her price for success, but that night, as the shadows danced across her walls, I became the knock that reminded her of everything she had forgotten, what it meant to feel, what it meant to hope, what it meant to imagine being loved. Elena was not a woman who gave away her trust lightly. That much was obvious from the moment she let me step into her house. Her body language spoke louder than her words, every gesture, every careful glance, told me she was measuring the danger of letting me stay a moment longer. But there was also something else there, something more fragile and harder to hide. It was in the way her eyes lingered on mine when she thought I wasn't paying attention, the way her voice trembled when silence stretched too long. She had been alone for so long that the simple act of sitting across from another person in her living room felt like walking on uncharted ground. I asked her questions, but not the kind that demanded answers. I wanted to give her room to breathe, to unfold slowly, at her own pace. "Do you ever go into town?" I asked gently, watching the way her fingers traced the rim of her glass. She shook her head, not looking at me. "Not much," she said quietly. "Too many eyes. Too many questions." Her words carried a heaviness that only someone who had lived under scrutiny could understand. I leaned back, studying her. "And here?" I asked. "Isn't it lonely?" Her lips pressed together, and for a moment, I thought she wouldn't answer. Then, with a sigh that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her chest, she whispered, "Lonely is safe. People are not." Those words sat between us like a confession she hadn't meant to share. I could see the truth in her eyes. This house, this silence, this distance from the world was not a choice of luxury but of survival. She had been hurt before, deeply enough to make her believe that solitude was the only shield that could protect her. And yet, as much as she clung to that shield, I could feel the ache of longing underneath it, the desperate hunger for connection she had been denying herself for years. I shifted closer, not too close to scare her, but just enough to bridge the invisible space she had built around herself. You don't have to be afraid of me, I said softly, my voice steady, reassuring. I'm not here to take anything from you. I'm here because I see you, and you deserve to be seen. Her eyes snapped up to meet mine, sharp and searching. For a moment, I wondered if I had pushed too far, if I had overstepped a line she had drawn. But then something unexpected happened. Her shoulders, which had been tight and rigid since the moment I arrived, loosened just slightly, like a crack in armor that had been welded shut for too long. You don't know me, she murmured, though her voice lacked the force of a warning. It sounded more like a plea, a desperate reminder she was trying to convince herself of. I know enough, I replied. I know what pain looks like when it tries to hide behind strength. I know what it's like to convince yourself that you're better off alone because you're afraid of being broken again. Her breath caught, sharp and unsteady, and I knew I had touched a wound she had buried deeply. She turned away, staring at the fire flickering faintly in the corner of the room, her jaw clenched as if holding back the tide of emotions threatening to surface. It's not that simple, she said at last, her voice trembling. People don't understand. They never do. They look at me and see money, power, someone who doesn't need anyone. But they don't see how much it costs to keep standing when the world has already decided what you are. Her words struck me with a force I hadn't expected. I saw in her not the untouchable woman of wealth the world imagined, but a soul worn thin from carrying too many expectations, too many judgments. And beneath it all, I saw a woman who had once wanted love, who had once believed in it, but had learned the hard way that love could be used against her, twisted into a weapon. I reached out, my hand hesitating before resting gently on the armrest near hers. Not touching her yet, just close enough to remind her she wasn't alone. Maybe they don't see it, I said softly, but I do. And I'm not afraid of what it costs to stand with you. She turned back to me then, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, and for the first time since I stepped into her world, she didn't look guarded. She looked vulnerable, and that vulnerability was more beautiful than any mask she had worn before. She didn't cry, not yet, but the way her lips trembled told me she wanted to. Instead, she asked quietly, almost like a child, why? Why would you care? The question wasn't about me, it was about her. It was about the part of her that couldn't believe she was worth caring for, not when she had spent so long punishing herself with silence and solitude. I leaned forward, my voice steady but filled with the tenderness I wanted her to feel. Because sometimes the people who shut the world out are the ones who deserve love the most. Because I know what it's like to be invisible even when everyone's watching. And because when I look at you, Elena, I don't see fortune or solitude. I see someone who's been waiting her whole life for someone to finally stay. Her breath hitched, and in that moment, the distance between us felt smaller than ever. She didn't answer, not with words, but the way her hand twitched slightly closer to mine told me everything I needed to know. A small, tentative step, but a step nonetheless. The room fell into a quiet that wasn't heavy anymore. It was gentle, almost soothing, the kind of silence that allows two hearts to listen to each other without words. For the first time, I saw the faintest curve at the corner of her lips, a smile so fragile I almost thought I imagined it. And I realized then that the fortress wasn't impenetrable after all. All it needed was someone willing to keep knocking. Someone patient enough to wait until the walls grew tired of standing. That night, when I finally stood to leave, she didn't let me go with the same indifference she had greeted me with. She walked me to the door, and just as my hand touched the knob, her voice stopped me. "Will you come back?" she asked, and though the words were soft, they carried the weight of years of silence breaking apart. I turned to her, smiling gently, my heart swelling at the vulnerability in her eyes. "If you'll let me," I whispered, and for the first time in what I could only imagine was years, Elena nodded, her expression fragile but certain. "Then come back." The next day I found myself walking the same long path up to her house, the gravel crunching beneath my shoes like a rhythm guiding me forward. I told myself I was only going to check on her, only going because she had asked me to come back. But deep inside, I knew it was more than that. Something about Elena had begun to stir a restlessness in me, something I couldn't quite name yet but felt growing stronger each time I thought of her. When I reached her door, I hesitated for a moment, afraid that maybe she would regret her invitation, that maybe she had closed herself off again overnight. But when she opened the door, the hesitation in her eyes wasn't as sharp as before. She looked surprised, almost uncertain, but beneath that was a flicker of relief, like she had been waiting though she didn't dare admit it. Her hair was down this time, falling around her shoulders in soft waves that made her look less like the untouchable woman I had first met and more like someone who was finally beginning to let go. She stepped aside wordlessly, allowing me in, and as I walked past her, I noticed the faint warmth in the air that hadn't been there before. She had lit the fire this time, its soft glow pushing back the emptiness that had filled the house before. It wasn't much, but it was something. We sat again in the living room, but the silence between us wasn't as heavy as before. I could feel her watching me, not with suspicion, but with curiosity, as if she was trying to piece together who I was and why I had chosen to stay. I decided not to dance around it. "You asked me to come back," I said softly, meeting her gaze. "Why?" She looked away quickly, her fingers curling against the arm of the chair. "I don't know," she whispered. Maybe because when you were here last night, the silence didn't feel so suffocating." Her honesty struck me deeply. This woman who had built her life on walls and distance was slowly peeling them back, and though she was afraid, she was still trying. I leaned forward slightly, careful not to overwhelm her. "Then let me stay until it feels like you can breathe again," I said gently. Her eyes flickered to mine, searching, weighing the sincerity in my words. For a long moment, neither of us spoke, and then she gave a small nod, barely noticeable but full of meaning. That nod was permission, a quiet invitation into a part of her world she had never shared with anyone. The hours slipped by as we talked, at first about small things, books she kept on the shelves but admitted she rarely read, paintings on the walls she hadn't chosen herself. Her voice was hesitant, like every word was testing the ground before taking another step. But slowly, as the night deepened, her words grew freer. She told me about her childhood, about a mother who loved her but never truly saw her, and a father who valued her only for what she could achieve. She spoke about how the world had taught her to harden herself, to treat vulnerability as weakness, and how she had carried that lesson like a shield all her life. I listened without interrupting, my heart tightening with every piece of herself she revealed. And when she fell silent, her eyes glassy with emotions she could no longer hide, I reached out, this time closing the distance between us. My hand touched hers, warm and steady, and for a moment she froze, caught between the instinct to pull away and the aching desire to hold on. Slowly, trembling, she let her fingers settle against mine, The softness of that touch was more powerful than anything else that had happened between us. It wasn't grand or dramatic, but it was honest. It was the first time she had allowed herself to be held, even if only by the tips of her fingers, and in that fragile connection, I felt the weight of her solitude lifting just slightly. Her voice broke the quiet, shaky but vulnerable. I don't remember the last time someone touched me without wanting something in return. I squeezed her hand gently, leaning closer so she could see the truth in my eyes. Then let this be the first time you remember differently. She looked at me then, truly looked, and for the first time her eyes didn't hide. They were raw, filled with fear, longing, and something new, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a very long time. I could see her fighting it, trying to push it back, but at the same time, I could feel her surrendering, letting the moment carry her closer to the truth she had buried inside herself. We sat like that for what felt like hours, our hands linked, the fire casting shadows around us, the silence between us now full of meaning instead of emptiness. And in that stillness, I knew this was only the beginning. Elena had lived her life believing solitude was her punishment, the price she had to pay for everything she had gained. But as she held on to me, fragile yet certain, I saw the faintest light of a future she had never dared imagine. She didn't ask me to leave that night. Instead, when the hours grew late and my body felt heavy with exhaustion, she stood slowly, guiding me toward the door, but not with distance this time, with hesitation, like she wanted me to stay but didn't yet know how to ask. At the door, she stopped, her eyes flickering with conflict, and finally whispered, "Thank you, for not letting me be invisible." I smiled at her, my chest aching at the tenderness of her words. "You were never invisible to me," I whispered back, and as I stepped into the night, I knew this connection we were building was not something fleeting. It was fragile, yes, and it would take time, but it was real. And sometimes, real was all a broken heart needed to begin healing. The following days carried a different rhythm. I found myself waking up with her face in my thoughts, the softness of her hesitant eyes lingering like an echo I couldn't shake. It wasn't just curiosity anymore, it was a pull, something magnetic that urged me back to her. I didn't question it too much, I simply let it guide me. By the third evening, when I once again climbed that long gravel path, my heart no longer raced with doubt. Instead, it beat with anticipation, a quiet certainty that whatever this was, it was worth chasing. When Elena opened the door this time, she didn't hesitate. There was no suspicion in her eyes, no guarded wall in her expression. She simply stepped aside and let me in, almost as if she had been waiting near the door long before I knocked. Her hair was tied loosely this time, her clothes more relaxed, and for the first time I noticed how human she looked, no longer the distant woman of fortune, but someone who was slowly allowing herself to breathe in another's presence. The fire was already lit, a pot of tea waiting on the table between two cups. The simple detail struck me, it meant she had prepared for me, expected me. She had thought about me before I arrived, and in her careful, cautious way, she had made space for me in her solitude. That gesture alone filled my chest with a warmth I didn't expect. We sat across from each other, sipping tea in silence, but it wasn't the awkward silence of strangers anymore. It was a silence that spoke of comfort, of safety. I could feel her eyes on me, studying, trying to memorize, and I let her. I let her take her time, because I knew she had spent too many years never daring to look at anyone too closely. Finally, she set her cup down and asked a question so sudden it startled me. Why do you keep coming back? I set my cup down slowly, meeting her gaze. Because you let me, I said. Because there's something here that matters. And because I want to. Her lips pressed together as if she wanted to argue, but the words never came. Instead, she leaned back, her eyes softening, and for the first time she allowed a small laugh to escape, a sound so quiet and fragile it nearly broke me. It wasn't a laugh of amusement, but of disbelief, like she couldn't understand how someone could choose her when she had spent years convincing herself she wasn't worth choosing. You don't know what you're stepping into, she said finally, her voice low, trembling slightly. My life, it's complicated. People only see the fortune. They don't see what it took to build it, or what it cost me. And if they did, they wouldn't stay. Her confession was heavy, her tone almost a warning, but I didn't flinch. I leaned forward, my voice steady. Maybe I don't know everything yet. But I know enough to stay. I'm not afraid of what it cost you, Elena. I'm only afraid of what it's still costing you now. Her eyes glistened, and she looked away quickly, blinking as though trying to hide the emotions threatening to rise. She stood abruptly, moving toward the window where the rain had started to fall in soft patterns against the glass. I followed her slowly, not wanting to press too hard, but needing her to know I wouldn't let her retreat too far back into her shell. Do you ever get tired? I asked quietly, standing just behind her. She didn't turn to look at me. Her shoulders tensed, her hands gripped the edge of the window frame, and then she whispered, every single day. The honesty in those 3 words cut through me. She had built her life to appear unbreakable, untouchable, and yet here she was, admitting the weight she carried had drained her for years. I reached out slowly, gently placing my hand on her shoulder. She stiffened at first, but then, slowly, her body softened beneath my touch, as if she was surrendering to something she had denied herself for far too long. You don't have to carry it alone anymore, I said softly. You don't have to keep pretending you don't need anyone. Not with me. She turned then, her face inches from mine, her eyes wide and filled with something I hadn't seen before. Fear, yes, but also longing. She searched my face as if trying to find the catch, the reason I would eventually walk away. But when she found nothing but sincerity in my eyes, her lips parted, trembling, and for a moment it felt like the entire world had stilled between us. I don't know if I remember how to let someone in, she whispered. I smiled gently, brushing a strand of hair from her face, my fingers grazing her cheek with the lightest touch. Then let me remind you, I said. Her breath shivered against my hand, and I felt her leaning ever so slightly closer, as if torn between pulling away and finally surrendering. She didn't kiss me, not yet, but the closeness, the electricity in the air, was enough to say what words could not. It was the beginning of something fragile, something real, something she was terrified of but could no longer deny. We stood there for a long time, the rain outside drumming a rhythm against the glass, her body trembling softly under the weight of a choice she was slowly beginning to make. And as I held her gaze, I knew she was starting to believe, for the first time in years, that love wasn't just a risk. It was also a chance to be free. The next day came with a strange weight in my chest, a mixture of nervousness and longing. I thought about her words, "Come back tomorrow," and how fragile they had sounded, like she was asking me for something she wasn't sure she deserved. It played in my mind all morning, through every distraction, until I finally found myself on the same path again, gravel crunching beneath my steps. But this time was different. This time I didn't feel like a stranger walking up to her fortress. I felt like someone being allowed inside, someone carrying a fragile piece of her trust, and it made me move carefully, almost reverently. When Elena opened the door, she didn't hide the relief in her face. She didn't try to mask it behind sharp words or careful posture. She just looked at me as though she had been holding her breath all day and could finally let it out. She stepped aside silently, and I entered, noticing something different immediately. The house no longer felt cold. The fire was burning, music played softly in the background, something gentle, wordless, filling the air without overwhelming it. She had made the space warmer, more alive, and I couldn't help but think she had done it for me. She guided me into the kitchen this time instead of the living room. The table was set with 2 plates, simple food, nothing elaborate, but the act of it nearly undid me. It wasn't about the meal, it was about what it meant. She had prepared to share something with me, to break the silence of years with the clinking of cutlery and the sound of our voices mingling across a table. It was intimacy in its simplest, most human form, and it was more powerful than any grand gesture could have been. We ate slowly, and I let her speak first when she was ready. Her words came in fragments at first, stories about how she had once loved cooking but had stopped when she began living alone, how meals had become just another routine instead of something to enjoy. "It feels different tonight," she admitted quietly, her fork pausing halfway to her mouth. "Like the food tastes better simply because someone else is here." I smiled, leaning closer across the table. "That's because food was never meant to be eaten in silence. It was meant to be shared, like everything else worth living for." Her eyes softened, and for a brief second I saw something light flicker in them, something that looked almost like joy. She shook her head with a quiet laugh. "You make it sound so simple, like I've been missing out on the easiest things in life while I was too busy, surviving." "You have been," I said gently. "But that doesn't mean you can't start now." The meal stretched on, filled with more laughter than I expected. Her laugh was still cautious, still rare, but each time it came, it loosened something inside her. After we finished, she didn't let the evening end. Instead, she invited me to walk through the house with her, showing me corners she had never shown anyone. She led me into her library, her voice trembling as she admitted she hadn't read many of the books on the shelves, that sometimes she bought them simply to fill the space so people would believe she lived a fuller life than she did. I touched the spines gently, smiling at her confession. "Maybe we can start reading them together," I offered, and though she didn't answer, the faint blush that colored her cheeks told me enough. Later, as we moved into the wide hallway filled with paintings, she stopped before one particular piece, an abstract swirl of colors, chaotic and almost violent. "This one," she whispered, "was painted by someone I once loved. Or thought I did. It was the last gift she gave me before she left. Sometimes I keep it here as a reminder. Sometimes I hate that I can't throw it away." I stood beside her, close enough to feel the sadness in her voice seep into me. "You don't have to erase the past to move forward," I said softly. "But you don't have to carry its weight forever either. Maybe keeping it isn't about her. Maybe it's about you trying to remember who you were when you still believed in love." Her eyes glistened, and she turned to me, her expression open, vulnerable. "And what if I don't know how to believe again?" I took her hand gently, intertwining our fingers, grounding her. Then let me believe enough for the both of us until you learn again." Her breath trembled at my words, and she squeezed my hand tightly, as if afraid that if she let go, I would disappear. We stood like that for a long while, in front of the painting, not looking at it anymore but at each other, as if trying to write over old memories with new ones. The evening carried us back to the living room, where the fire had dwindled to a warm glow. She sat beside me this time, not across from me, the space between us smaller than it had ever been. Her shoulder brushed against mine, tentative but intentional, and I didn't move away. Instead, I leaned just enough for her to feel my presence steady and sure. "I don't know what this is," she whispered, her voice fragile but honest. "I don't know where it's going. But I don't want it to end." I turned to her, brushing my fingers across the back of her hand. "It doesn't have to end, Elena. Not if we choose to keep going." Her eyes searched mine, wide and uncertain, and for a moment the fear returned. But then, slowly, her hand slipped into mine, her grip firm this time, as though she had made a choice. She didn't kiss me, not yet, but the way she leaned into me, resting her head against my shoulder, was more intimate than any kiss could have been. It was trust. It was surrender. The house that had once been filled with silence now echoed with something new, soft breaths, quiet laughter, the gentle rhythm of two hearts beginning to beat in unison. And as the night deepened, I knew something had shifted forever. Elena was no longer just surviving. She was beginning to live. The days that followed became a rhythm neither of us had expected but both of us began to crave. Every evening, I found myself walking up that long driveway, and every evening Elena was there, waiting. Sometimes she opened the door before I even knocked, as if she had been standing near it, listening for the sound of my steps on the gravel. Each night her house felt a little warmer, her eyes a little softer, her silence less heavy. It was as if my presence was slowly rewriting the story she had told herself for years, that she was safer alone, that solitude was the only way to survive. Now, piece by piece, that story was unraveling. On the seventh evening, when I arrived, I noticed the change immediately. She wasn't wearing the sharp clothes she had once used as armor. Instead, she greeted me in a simple sweater, her hair loose, her feet bare against the wooden floor. She looked younger like this, freer, almost unrecognizable from the untouchable woman who had first opened the door to me. Her smile, small, hesitant, but real, was the kind that carried warmth even if it wasn't fully ready to bloom. She led me into the living room, and instead of tea or food, she had laid a thick blanket across the couch, as if inviting me into something more personal, more intimate. She didn't explain, but she didn't have to. I sat beside her, the fire casting its glow across her face, and for the first time, she leaned against me without hesitation. Her head rested on my shoulder, her hand finding mine with a steadiness that told me she wasn't fighting it anymore. We stayed like that for a long time, saying little, letting the silence between us settle into something comfortable and safe. Eventually, her voice broke the quiet, soft and trembling. "Do you know how long it's been since I've let anyone sit this close to me?" I tilted my head toward her, brushing my cheek against her hair. "How long?" She let out a shaky laugh. "Years. Too many years. I forgot what it feels like to have someone here without expecting them to leave." I tightened my grip on her hand, grounding her. "I'm not going anywhere." Her breath caught up my words, and she lifted her head slightly to look at me. Her eyes searched mine with a vulnerability that nearly broke me. "Don't say that unless you mean it," she whispered. "I mean it," I replied firmly, holding her gaze. "I wouldn't be here if I didn't." For a moment, the fire crackled between us, the only sound filling the room, until she finally let out a sigh that sounded like surrender. She rested her head back against me, and her body softened, no longer tense, no longer braced for disappointment. It was as if she had finally allowed herself to believe me, even if just for that night. The hours drifted by as we spoke in fragments, her stories spilling out slowly. She told me about the first time she had fallen in love, about how it had ended with betrayal that cut so deep she swore she would never open her heart again. She spoke about friends who had drifted away, not because she didn't love them, but because her wealth had built walls she didn't know how to take down. She confessed how she had grown used to people looking at her and seeing only what she owned, never who she was. I listened, every word carving deeper into me, and when she faltered, I reached for her hand again, reminding her that she didn't have to be alone in her story anymore. At one point, her voice grew so quiet I could barely hear her. "Sometimes I wonder if people even remember who I am anymore. If I disappeared, would anyone notice? Would anyone care?" My heart ached at her confession, and I turned to face her fully, taking her face in my hands. "I would notice. I would care. Elena, you don't disappear just because people fail to see you. You're here, right now, and I see you. All of you." Her eyes filled with tears, and this time she didn't fight them. She let them fall, her hands gripping mine tightly as though I was her anchor in a storm. And for the first time since I had met her, she didn't try to hide her emotions. She let herself be seen in her rawest form, and the beauty of it stole the air from my lungs. She leaned forward then, slowly, hesitantly, her lips trembling as though she wasn't sure she had the right to do what she was about to do. I didn't move, didn't rush her, just let her find her courage. And when her lips finally brushed against mine, it wasn't a kiss of passion or hunger. It was fragile, trembling, like the first ray of sunlight after years of darkness. A promise more than a kiss. When she pulled back, her face flushed, her eyes wide, she whispered, "I don't know what I'm doing." I smiled gently, brushing my thumb across her cheek. "You don't have to know. Just feel. Just let yourself be here, with me." She nodded, her breath unsteady, and leaned into me again, this time with more certainty. We stayed that way for the rest of the night, wrapped in each other, the weight of her solitude finally breaking apart under the simple truth of being held. As the fire burned low and the house grew quiet, I realized we had crossed a threshold. Elena was no longer hiding, no longer pretending. She had let me in, not fully, not completely, but enough to know she wanted me there. And as I held her close, I knew that for the first time in her life, she believed she might not have to face the world alone anymore. Morning light spilled through the tall windows, soft and golden, brushing across the floorboards like a quiet reminder that the world outside still existed. Elena stirred beside me on the couch where we had fallen asleep, her head resting on my shoulder, her hand curled loosely against mine. For a moment, I didn't move. I just watched her breathe, the rise and fall of her chest, the faint curve of her lips even in sleep. She looked younger like this, stripped of the weight she carried when she was awake. And I realized then how much of her life had been spent bracing for loneliness, how much of her fortune had cost her peace. She had built walls so high no one could climb them, and yet somehow here I was, sitting on the inside with her. When she finally opened her eyes, they blinked against the morning light, confusion flickering before recognition settled in. Her lips parted as if to apologize for something, maybe for letting herself fall asleep in my arms, maybe for letting me see her vulnerable. But before she could speak, I squeezed her hand gently and whispered, "Good morning." The words were simple, ordinary, but I felt the weight they carried for her. Ordinary was something she hadn't had in years. Ordinary was a gift she had forgotten how to hold. Her eyes softened, and she let out a sound that was almost a laugh but trembled too much to be steady. "Good morning," she echoed, her voice husky from sleep. She sat up slowly, rubbing her hands across her face, then turned to look at me, her expression a mixture of fear and hope. "I didn't mean for you to stay all night," she said quietly. "I know," I replied gently. "But I'm glad I did." She looked at me for a long moment, as though searching my face for doubt, for hesitation, for any sign that I regretted being there. When she didn't find it, she sighed, her shoulders dropping as if some invisible burden had loosened. "It feels different," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Waking up and not being alone. I didn't think I'd ever feel that again." I reached out, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear, my fingers lingering against her skin. "You don't have to go back to being alone," I said softly. "Not unless you choose to." Her eyes shimmered, and she swallowed hard, her throat working against the emotions she was holding back. She leaned into my touch for the briefest second before pulling away, standing and pacing toward the window. The light framed her like a painting, but her posture was tense, conflicted. "You don't understand," she said, her voice breaking. "It's not just about being alone. It's about everything that comes with who I am. People see the money, the house, the name, and they don't see me. They use me. Or they leave me. And I can't." She paused, her hand trembling as it rested against the glass. "I can't go through that again." I stood and walked to her, placing my hand gently over hers against the cold window pane. She flinched slightly but didn't pull away. "I'm not here for any of that," I whispered. "I'm here because of you. Just you. The woman who makes tea too strong. The woman who hides her smile but doesn't realize how beautiful it is when it slips out anyway. The woman who thought solitude was the price for her fortune, but who deserves so much more than that." Her breath hitched, and she turned her face toward me, her eyes brimming with tears. "Why do you care so much?" "Because you deserve to be cared for," I answered simply. "And because somewhere along the way, without even realizing it, I fell for you." The words hung in the air between us, fragile and undeniable. Her lips parted as though she wanted to speak, but no sound came. Instead, she leaned forward, her forehead pressing against mine, her tears damp against my skin. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered. "You don't have to know," I murmured. "We can figure it out together." For the first time, she didn't argue. She didn't build walls or hide behind excuses. She simply let herself lean into me, her arms wrapping around my waist, holding me as though I was the only solid thing keeping her grounded. And in that moment, something in her shifted. The fortress she had lived inside crumbled, not with a crash, but with the quiet surrender of someone who was finally tired of fighting alone. The days that followed unfolded gently, like a story being rewritten. We cooked meals together, her laughter growing more natural, more frequent, as though it had just been waiting for someone to coax it out. We walked through her gardens, once neglected, now slowly coming back to life as she showed me the places she used to love. She began opening up about her past, not just the heartbreaks, but the dreams she had buried, the art she had abandoned, the places she longed to see but had convinced herself she no longer needed. And through it all, I stayed, not to fix her, not to change her, but to remind her that she was worthy of being seen, worthy of being loved. One evening, weeks later, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in colors that looked too beautiful to be real, she took my hand and led me back to the window where she had once confessed her fears. She looked out at the horizon, then turned to me with a steadiness I hadn't seen before. "You were right," she said softly. "I thought solitude was my price to pay. But maybe solitude was just my prison. And maybe you," her voice wavered, but she pressed on, her eyes locked on mine. "Maybe you're the key I didn't know I needed." I squeezed her hand, my chest swelling with a warmth I couldn't put into words. "And maybe you're the home I didn't know I was searching for." Her smile bloomed fully then, unguarded and radiant, and she kissed me, not with hesitation this time, but with the certainty of someone who had finally chosen to live again. The fire inside her that had once been dim was burning now, and I knew it wasn't just for me, it was for herself, for the woman she was reclaiming after so many years of silence. Together, we stood at that window, watching the sky darken, our hands intertwined, our hearts beating in rhythm. And for the first time in her life, Elena wasn't alone in her fortune, in her house, or in her heart. She had let someone in, and in doing so, she had set herself free.